Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Helen Knott. Helen is a Dane Zaa, Nehiyaw, Métis, and mixed Euro descent woman from Prophet River First Nations and lives in Fort St. John, British Columbia. Helen is a trauma survivor, an author, and has worked in social work and advocacy for over a decade. In 2016, Helen was one of the 16 global changemakers featured by the Nobel Women's Initiative for being committed to ending gender-based violence and was selected as a 2019 RBC Taylor Prize Emerging Author. Her debut memoir, In My Own Moccasins, was a national bestseller, longlisted for the BC Taylor Prize, and won the Saskatchewan Book Award for Indigenous Peoples Publishing. Becoming a Matriarch, her second memoir, will be released for Canadian audiences this summer. So, Helen, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you for having me.
I'm
very excited.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm very excited to have you. I gave a brief introduction of who you are, but so the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself, please?
Yeah. Tanse, Johanache, Sudase, Dishinatseke. I come from Prophet River First Nation, and there's always I'm not going to do it ever. Am I going to do it? But I really believe in introducing yourself in your language when you go into spaces. And I was told a long time ago that also pulls your ancestors into that space when you're able to do that. So just starting off in that way. And I am what you said I am, Dane Zaa, Métis, and Nehiyaw. But I'm a mom to one, so I have a teenage son, and I am now 11 years sober. So went through, and I know we're going to talk about it, but a bout of addiction for a very long time. And I recently just left a position as a director of Indigenous education, and right now I'm working on my next book, which is a fiction. And I'm really excited to do that because nonfiction and memoir I was writing about it this morning. I was like, it forces you to have hard conversations with yourself, about emotions, about events that have happened to your life that you otherwise wouldn't engage with if you didn't sit down to write. But they're so necessary in regards to, I guess, becoming and being able to shift and transform and to alchemize the pain or suffering or even good things that you've been through to kind of propel you forward into being in the world in a new way. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. When I had first reached out to you, if you remember, it was because I had heard Gabor Mate mention you in his book, The Myth of Normal. And I was so intrigued and I wanted to know more and, get you to tell your story in a way that I could present it to my audience. And he mentioned you because of your book, In My Own Moccasins. And when I read that book, oh my goodness, I feel like it changed me in so many ways. It was so deep and so personal and just so heartfelt. You poured your everything into that. And I'm sure it took a lot of courage for you to write that because it was so deeply personal. What did it mean for you to be able to write that book?
I feel like that book was liberation in the sense that, when you come from a childhood or background of trauma, it's so very hard to reach back for memory because every time you do, it can feel like wounding. And I remember my mom saying, well, why don't you ever write about the good things? And I was like, I'm trying to get there. I have to kind of dismantle or kind of clear the pathway of these hard memories to be able to hold on to the good ones. And I feel like writing that book allowed me space, not only to find the good memories within childhood and teenage years, but also cleared space to be able to create new memories and new pathways. And so writing that book allowed me personally to be able to do that. Outside of that, being as honest as I was, I knew it was for other women that had been through similar experiences as me. And since publication, which was in 2019, I get a lot of messages from women from, I would say primarily North America, who share their stories with me. And I'm always so grateful and so very humble to be able to hold space for another person's truth. And sometimes like being the first person that individual might tell their story to. And I feel like the world is such a lonely place. And when you hold on to your story and aren't able to bring it into the world in a good way, it becomes even lonelier. So being able to make those connections with people I've never met and I guess assist them in small ways in their own pursuit of like emotional liberation has been the best thing ever. So
I mean, I know that I got that from the book, and like I mentioned to you earlier, I'm not a woman, so I don't know what it's like to have your experiences, but I could still relate to so many things, and it touched me so deeply. So I just want to say thank you for being so brave and telling your story.
thank you. I think too, like just in regards to like how people experience hard events and learn to navigate their own traumas and emotions, or like not navigate and completely avoid, like a lot of that, there's a lot of commonalities in regards to that. And even in terms of how attachment is formed and what that looks like in our experience with it and the like narratives in our head, that a lot of us can connect on different or different levels. I don't know what I'm trying to say there.
Yeah,
Get it. I hope.
you also talk a lot about your experience being Native in Canada, and I understand that Canada has numbered treaties that were signed with Indigenous people. Can you talk a bit about Treaty Number 8 and how you're connected to it?
Yeah, so treaty number 8 is treaty number 8. Um, in this region that I'm from, in the northeast region of BC, so it's just a small little pocket. Actually, it's very large if you would think of like the geographic space that it spans, because in the north, everything is so spread out. So my reserve is close to 400 kilometers away. I don't know what that is in miles. And I'm still in Dane Zaa territory. Like I'm still in the north. I'm still home, but my reserve is still far away. And anyways, so back in the day when they were going around and signing treaties, a process that they would do quite often with the use of obviously an interpreter because not everybody spoke English. And with that, I guess like twisting the understanding of what that treaty meant or what it looked like, and giving people a different impression of um, the intention of the treaty. Because a lot of people were told like things aren't going to change; they're going to remain the same, and everything obviously has changed. And here in this region, I was doing some research and came across some letters, I guess, that were written back to the capital. I want to say like early 1800s. And it was like talking about the resources that we have in this region and saying, it would be really good if you sign treaty here because of the resources, and the resources being oil and gas, where that is like the primary industry here. So we have a lot of rigs, a lot of rig workers, a lot of transient workers. Anyways, and it wasn't until I think after 1905 or around that time where there were a lot of settlers coming through with wagons for the Klondike Rush, I believe it was at the time. And the Dane Zaa people here took all of the wagons and they pushed them off the valley cliffs. And my grandma told me that my grandpa, Makanacha, or my great great grandpa, was a part of that as well. And they were protesting, like, no more settlers coming through because, like, the food is sparse. Like, we're not sharing. And plus, the settlers that were coming through were stealing from food caches, which were like stores of food that were up in the trees. And so it was sometime just after that that, like, okay, things are getting a little out of hand over there, or so maybe we should sign a treaty with them. And they had already went through and signed numerous communities across the northern part of, anyways, it's hard because then I'm like trying to explain it from Canadian perspective, and I was like, how do I put this in different language? So yeah, and they basically did an adhesion, which was just like signing a pre-existing treaty in this area. And Makanacha, who was my great great grandpa, was a headman, or a chief, I guess, like would be the recognizable term. And I was told that he said he wasn't going to sign treaty, and he took the people back into the mountains and he was like, we're not doing this because I don't know what this looks like, and didn't trust the treaty making process. And other people have also told me that they were hoping that our specific group of people were just going to die off. Like, let's just not bother with them. That didn't happen. And eventually he signed treaty in 1911. And I believe that he was the last signatory on Treaty 8 as well.
Do you think that with the way things have been in the last couple of decades, that treaty would have been signed, had he known what would have become of the treaty being signed and how things turned out?
I don't know. Like, I feel like a part of him would reject this like colonial society, and understanding that that treaty didn't mean what it was supposed to mean, and the promises weren't kept nor fulfilled. So I think with that, and knowing the distrust in there, but also like then there's the foresight of, we're here, like in terms of colonization, and what does that look like, and how do you lead people through that process? And I know that there is, within BC, we're the only treated section of BC. The rest of it is unceded territory, which means that individuals had never signed a treaty. I think there's a modern day treaty, I believe, in the Northwest that was signed within this. I'm going to make up numbers, so I'm not going to say, but there's like a modern day one that was created, and maybe that would have been the route. But yeah, it's different being like the only part of BC that is like treated territory as well.
I see. What is
We do get $5 a year from that treaty.
Wow.
So it was pretty exciting. Anyways.
I was going to say, what are some common issues and strengths found in Indigenous communities?
I think one of the things, especially when you get further north, is the isolation of communities. A lot of communities are like an hour, hour and a half, sometimes like 3-4 hours from the nearest like urban center. I put urban in quotes because the further you go north, they're like towns and very, very small places. And with that isolation and a history of like trauma through colonial policy, whether it be, the residential school era where they removed Indigenous children from their homes and put them in residential schools. And we know that a lot of those children also didn't make it back home after that, or made it back home having endured very hard traumas. And then there was the 60s scoop, which, like, in the 1960s, after there was a transition of care of Indian children from like the federal government, which is a larger government structure like the national one, to a provincial government. once that care transitioned to the provincial one, then that's when I guess like social workers were able to get involved and then just started taking Indian children out of Indian homes and placing them with white families. So then it was just a movement from a different system from one to another. And outside of that, there's like the pass system, which like Indians weren't allowed to leave the reservation without a written pass from an Indian agent. And if you were like caught outside of those spaces without a pass, you could be put in jail. And I think the ramifications of those, like, there's so many different tangents. So I think of like the the pass system and that impact on our Indigenous men in regards to not being able to provide for their families like they once were and fulfilling that role of being like the provider slash warrior, whatever that looks like. And what that does to family structures, but also like community structures too, overall. And then with Indigenous women, the exposure to violence and people current day, like still really dealing with those issues. And within communities, sometimes that arises from or in ways of like suicide ideation, addiction, violence. I myself haven't lived on my reserve, so I don't know and I can't speak to like what life is like there. I go back and visit often, and then my grandma actually was adopted into a different reserve than the one that we belong to. And I said, Junie, come live with us. We'll give you a home. So I spent time there. But there's also just like a lot of here. I would say culture doesn't necessarily show up in ways that like the outside world thinks it is because they're like, oh, song and dance, like ceremony, give me that. And with Dane Zaa people, a lot of it is just land based and through dreams. Like we were dreamers. So um, knowing a lot of young boys that are quite capable in regards to like going hunting and being able to like get a moose and process it and skin it and like fill their family's freezers. And I feel such pride, I guess, in that, in knowing that like our young men are still carrying on these ways in that regard. So there's a lot of that here, a lot of land based knowledge that is thriving in the North.
Because of some of the things that you described, what are some tools or practices for Indigenous people who struggle with trauma or suicide or addiction?
Yeah, I think I know it's different for everyone. And I remember my mom when I had to learn how to heal or was finally at that like very crucial moment of like, okay, like life or death healing. Like, what does this look like? And she said that she heard somebody speak and they said healing looks different for everyone and you have to allow people to heal how they need to heal. And for me, that was through ceremony. So being able, you know, I got sober through a peyote ceremony, which isn't a practice that is from here. It's actually from like the South. And being grateful enough to experience that and be able to interact with that medicine in such a way where it gave me the foundation to heal. And I feel like it's like always like a multi-pronged approach, right? That you're trying from all of these different angles to build this pathway to wellness. So there was like ceremony and there was sweat lodge, which also is in that ceremony space, but then there was therapy and being able to uh, I guess, vocalize events that I hadn't before. And I hit this point of being like, and I think this is that tip part is like being as real as you can and being willing to be, I guess, like to be truthful and kind of venture into those spaces that are probably a little bit scary because freedom is on the other side of that. And I remember I went to rehab 4 times and the first 3 times, I ventured into some of the stories and I was like, well, I don't have to tell that story. Like, that one's fine back there. I don't have to tell that story. That one's fine back there. And the last time that I went there, I'm like, okay, like, I'm leaving nothing back there. I'm going to throw it out all on the table and have these hard conversations that, perhaps made my skin crawl with shame or whatever that looked like, because I wanted to live. Like, I no longer wanted to hurt. And I think it's important to, I guess, be as honest as you can and to understand that other people can help you on that journey, because sometimes you can be like very distrustful too, or not wanting to listen. There was a point too where I thought like, well, I can just read my way through this. Like, I can learn things and figure it out. No, I could only do so much of that, because at the end of the day, like, a broken mind can't fix a broken mind. And I heard that in AA, and that like shifted my understanding of like, oh, that's why I can't do it on my own, because I don't know how to do this. Like, my mind is actually broken and I need someone with an outside insight to be able to help me see my own shortcomings and flaws and my, I guess, defects in thinking, so that I could find new ways. And yeah, I know I just like ramble a lot too.
No, you're fine. That was great. I've never heard a broken mind can't fix a broken mind, but it makes a lot of sense, because if you're trying to heal and the person who is trying to help you is also in the same state, you're just going to go in circles, I would think, anyway.
Yeah. And for me, because I am fairly intellectual and I like to live in this like mental state. So I'm like, oh, I can think my way through this. I can read a book. I can help myself process this. And being able to recognize that I wasn't able to intellectualize. Is that the way I say that word? My way through it was like hard. And then I even noticed that now, where I'm like, okay, I'm living in my head a lot. I have to feel my way through this. There's a different pathway through what I'm going through. And now, knowing when I need to reach out, because I'm 11 years sober, that doesn't mean I don't go through things where I still need some assistance. So for example, when I was about to do the audiobook for My Own Moccasins, which didn't come out with the paper print version, but I was going to do the audiobook like I think 2 or 3 years later, and I didn't want to do it because the story is hard and I didn't want to vocalize. I was really scared of it, actually. I was like, this is going to be scary and this could really hurt me. So even prior to that, I found myself a therapist and started seeing her, I think maybe a month beforehand, just to prepare, because I was like, I don't know what this will be like. It may be very rocky. Let me give myself some like additional care during this time. And it was actually like I did a lot better than I thought I would. And I think sometimes like we often undershoot our own strength or our own ability to walk through things. And it's not until we actually put ourselves in those spaces that we're able to see, oh, okay, like, I'm actually okay. And then one other thing, too, that I've learned throughout this like healing journey is that when I do have a time where I am triggered and I'm thrown back to a space where I am like crying or my body reacts and I'm having that kind of full PTSD effect, that doesn't undo all of the healing that I've done. That I allow that story to visit for that moment. I let it through like my body, and I'm like, okay, well, what am I learning here? How am I interacting with this story differently? But really understanding that that doesn't reset all of the healing. I'm not back at the beginning. I can like take that breather, take that moment, feel through it, and then be like, okay, we actually aren't living there. This is where we're at.
That's growth. and awareness. Because I think I remember my therapist told me the brain can't tell the difference between same and similar. So
Mm.
in those moments, if you're triggered, you may relive where the trigger actually came from. So being able to recognize,
Mhm.
okay, I've done a lot of work, and this is just a feeling. I need to feel it and let it go. That's big.
Yeah, my girlfriend used to tell me, like, we live life in a spiral, and it's like not a linear fashion, but it's a spiral. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, we live life in a spiral. Like, linear fashion is like more of a colonial construction, but I was like, I don't know what that means. And it wasn't until later, I think I was having a conversation with someone and we were talking about it. I was like, okay, because we're also like revisiting our story from different spaces, right? So story comes again, or it's like a certain season in our life, and like there's the littlest things, right, that can throw us back. And sometimes it is like literally like the change of season can put you back to something you experienced like 10 years ago in fall
Mm.
time, or songs or whatever. I know even sometimes it would just be like me at a stoplight or me brushing my teeth, and these like things would just like interject themselves, me having to ground myself. But within a spiral, like as long as you're growing and healing, you're revisiting it, but you can see it from a different angle and with more wisdom. So I think it was last summer, there was an event that had taken place, and it was like really triggering for me, where I was a little out of it for probably about a week and like did a lot of crying, and I was really angry. And then I had to be like, okay, like, what are the feelings that are existing here? What am I learning? And in some weird way, I ended up being really grateful for that experience, because I was like, okay, I can let go of these things that I didn't know I was holding on to, and um, am able to, yeah, heal and feel through it. I feel like old me would be like, but yeah.
That's great. I mean, you have done so much work. I mean, just your book alone shows the amount of massive work you've done. But actually hearing you, give these examples too shows that you're doing it and you're providing room for others to learn from you as well. So thank you. Also, I wanted to get into something that Gabor mentioned in his book that was a quote directly from your book that I think was the point to where I was like, okay, who is this? Because this is huge. Um, and it was such a vivid description of emotional pain. And I had never thought about it like that. You mentioned at one point you had begun cutting, and you said those brief moments of the sharp blade dragging across skin provided me with a relief for the hate I felt for myself. It was as if the moment the skin opened up, it became a vent that poured out all of the effed up whirling emotions. And man, that painted such a picture, a vivid picture of internalized pain and how physical pain can actually provide relief for emotional pain, deep emotional pain. So I wanted to give you an opportunity, if you would, to kind of expound on those moments and how you recovered from them.
Yeah. So I know for a long time, like cutting was something that allowed me to almost like, it sounds weird, but like maintain equilibrium. And like, obviously, I wasn't balanced in the first place because I was living a very like hard life, engaging in substance abuse and all of these other things. But it was almost like it was a release. It allowed me to um, put up with myself, because I feel like even the act of substance abuse within my life, that was all a form of trying to stay alive, even though it was killing me. But it was like a measure that was kind of put into place that allowed me to cope with everyday living because everything was just too much all of the time. Even with substance use, substance allowed me to, I guess, take the edge off of emotions and feelings that were there that felt like they were threatening my life. They weren't life threatening, but they very much felt like it. So, in a strange way, even though substance was killing me, it was also keeping me alive for that time because I didn't know how to be alive. I didn't have coping strategies. I didn't know how to navigate all of this pain that felt like it was like a tidal wave that would sweep me away and that I wouldn't be able to function and or um, exist had I acknowledged it. And especially when it's so much at once, and the psychological stress of that type of trauma too is, it really feels like it's immense. So in a weird way, substance abuse almost claimed my life, but it also kept me alive. And I think with physical pain, in terms of like cutting, it was like a form of that, something that allowed me to um, endure. And the stopping of that also was just like, I think one time, no, I know one time I cut too deep and it scared me. And I was like, okay, that is beyond like a coping mechanism. And I don't want to do that anymore. And also, yeah, anyways.
Well, I remember how deeply I felt that, and I almost saw in my mind like the vent opening up and allowing the emotional pain to come out, and I was just blown away. And I I had never heard of, I guess, a coping mechanism that was so descriptive, nor had I really, I guess, felt emotional pain so deep that I needed physical pain to combat it. So it just gave me a window into how deeply someone can be hurting and needing relief. And I thought about how many people are feeling that or who may have felt that. And you describing it that way may have actually given them, for the first time, words that describe what it was. And I thought it was such a
Mm.
gift.
I feel like now that arises in like different ways that are healthy. Like when I went through a lot of grief, I got a lot of tattoos that
Mm.
year. And like that's a lot of physical pain, right? And it was like getting tattoos actually kept me sober
Mm.
when I was going through like really heavy grief. And I was like, that's interesting to see that correlation of like physical pain um, and being able to utilize that for balance. And I used to be a runner. And I would run really long distances all of the time. And I would run through the pain, which was like a really bad idea because I messed up my
Mm.
knees. But I would run through it. And looking back at the level that I ran and what I ran through when I probably should have like took it easy at certain parts, knowing that there was a part of me at that time using that as a coping mechanism and um, feeling that pain and being able to kind of utilize that. So I think it arises in different ways, in different forms in many people's lives, right? Whether it be like through actual self harm or even, I would say, even things like overspending and like being wild in those ways, like all of these little things that we do to kind of like, I don't know.
No, I get it. I mean, anything can be a vice. That's what I've learned.
Yeah.
And just because one thing doesn't look as bad as another, it doesn't mean that you're not coping. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, it is what it is. If we're calling a spade, we have to be honest. All right, so I wanted to quote something that you said. You said, "I used to believe that sexual abuse was exclusively an Indian girl experience when I was growing up. I remember when I met my first Indian girl at age 14 who hadn't been sexually abused, and I was so confused. That feels like it had to give you mixed emotions because it's huge and sad all in one. Can you kind of talk about that and describe it?
Yeah, I think that's, growing up thinking that it was a very common experience, but also not having that expectation of my non Indigenous friends that they had been through something similar. Um, I didn't think that. It was just like, oh, well, this is what happens to us as like Native girls, is that we are subjected in Native kids like to sexual abuse. This is just something that happens because it was so um, like such a common experience among a lot of people that I knew, and especially obviously within my family structure too. And even hearing stories of like, yeah, that happened to like my mom and all of my aunties. Like it was just what was. And it was so different to have that friend who was like, Dad, that's never happened to me. Like that's actually not normal. And it was actually her who told my mom when I was struggling about like additional abuse that my mom didn't know about. And she was like, well, you should probably know this. And that kind of moved me, I guess, into I wouldn't say like a space like of a trajectory of healing, but it definitely shifted that dialogue and that ability to speak with my mom about things that had happened. Not all of it, but some of it at that moment in time. So it was like a crucial thing to happen. But to go through things and then to feel like that's like a like the normalization of violence. And I wonder how many other Indigenous girls growing up that are very young that may have those same thoughts, because I don't doubt that they exist, that there are still girls that probably where that is their norm. And I remember telling someone, I'm like, just because you leave the war doesn't mean like, and you found peace doesn't mean it's not still going on. Like, there's still people growing up in these types of homes that are really struggling with that. And I think the youngest reader that I had that reached out to me was like 15. And we talked about things that she had been through and she was going through, and all of these different stories that she was holding, and knowing that it's not an Indigenous girl experience, and what that says about body and how we other bodies, right, and sexualize bodies, and what's allowable. Like there's so much in that space too, that I've had to deconstruct as an adult and throughout my own healing of like, okay, well, what did I learn about my body from society? What did I learn about my body from this northern culture that I grew up in, from the household that I grew up in, and being able to disassemble that and identify those voices when they pop into my own head, and being able to be like, okay, that's not the truth. And um, replace them with my own narratives, and really seeing, the work of like aunties and moms and dads and uncles and whatever, in terms of like creating safe spaces for their families. And I feel like there is that ripple of healing that's coming through with generations now, where they're changing what that looks like for family structures. And even in terms of my own healing, like I really see it as like, okay, like I'm healing things that weren't talked about. I'm talking about things that weren't talked about. And I've come in to do this healing work on myself, but also knowing that that will ripple into my family structure and into my community. And knowing that a lot of us are doing that work out there, and I can take rest and solace in that.
Hmm. I think this generation just overall wants different and better because they're understanding that a lot of the things that we've lived with don't make sense, or why are we still doing it that way? And I mean, I can't speak for the indigenous community, but I mean, just hearing you say that, it sounds like it's the same. So um, I do think that there's for sure changes happening, and we need them. We need them because these old, antiquated ways of doing things just it's time. It's time for them to be shelved and to have healthy family structures and relationships and all the things. So you wrote a poem called "The Things We Taught Our Daughters." And Helen, oh my God, it's so good. So good. I literally cried my eyes out every time I listened to you read it, because I could feel the depth of your pain, and in the words you translated to reality for so many women, what your experience was. And I'm sure that they could also grab onto that and have like a buoy for safety, because your burden was so palpable. You said sometimes we taught them silence to let secrets stay on their lips. Sometimes to protect our own wounds, we taught our daughters not to feel. If you focus hard enough on forgetting, you can live through any kind of hell. And those were the things that stuck out to me because that was just like, wow, that's so true. And I wanted to ask, from your perspective, what are some ways and some things that we can do to help break these cycles?
Yeah, I think a part of that is just like learning how to communicate, um, have conversations. I know it's not always possible either to kind of like heal backwards, to go back and have those conversations with our parents or our grandparents, because some people don't want to talk
Mm,
about it, right? Some people just will flat out refuse. And I think making peace with that is knowing that individuals may never change. And all we can do, if that is the case, is being able to work on ourselves and being able to change how we're in relationship with people. What does that look like? How do we show up for ourselves? How do we build a language of healing that we can pass on, like those vocabularies to our children, like emotional literacy, um, all of those things. And if you don't have children, then being able to model that for like nieces and nephews and chosen family, um, because like kinship comes in so many different forms, right? It's not always through family. We have chosen people that we walk alongside through this life, um, and I think, yeah, being able to navigate and sit in hard spaces with people, because sometimes if we don't know or haven't sat with our own brokenness, then we don't know how to do that with other people. And they say that in like social work, right? Like, or I don't know if it's any healing work, but like you can only take people as far as you've been yourself. And that's true. Like that's true. And just like I feel like relationships too, and you can feel it. Like, if you're like grieving or going through something really hard, you have the friend who like will check in to see if you're yourself. And if you're not, they'll be like, okay, like
mm,
bye, like I'll come back later. Because they don't know how to sit with it. And then there's some people who will just like flat out tell you, like, I'm not good with this stuff. Like, I probably won't be around. I like that kind of honesty usually. Um, and you can feel that around people too. Like when you know that they've like been through things, like if you're allowed to or you're able to just like hold that space for someone as they fall apart and not try to like fix it or stop it from happening, but being able to witness alongside someone and hold their hand while they kind of like face that deep, like personal abyss. For me, that's like the marker of someone who like has been through their because they're like sometimes we just need people to witness things with us, versus like being fixed or any of those other things, right?
I agree. I agree. Um, so speaking of your poem again, because I loved it so much, you end the poem so beautifully. You say, "It's time to remember Time to summon our voices from the belly of the earth. Time to feel, cry, rage, heal, and truly live life instead. It's time to tell ourselves and our daughters the things that they should have been said. And I think that that is such a beautiful tribute to anyone who's experienced pain and had to be silenced about it. It's such a healing balm. And I can't say enough about that poem. And I just wanted to read the ending so that our listeners can hear it, and if they need to have that, they can relate to it and have it as something that they can grab onto.
Hmm.
And then also, you made an offering and a dedication in the beginning of your memoir. And if you would you please read it for us?
Yeah, I can do that. I had to go find my book because, like, I didn't know where it was, and I was like, "That's bad." So donate things. Okay. Someone somewhere once told me that a song will travel the world until someone is ready to receive it. Since then, I have imagined stories and poetry roaming the earth. Right now, invisible words are being carried by gusts of wind, trying to find someone to bring them into this world. Metaphors and similes are wandering the streets looking for a home. I did not catch this story riding in on a breeze, or stumble into it in the grocery aisle while looking to complete my shopping list. I have lived this story. I had to pull this story out of body, out of bone, out of a place so deep that it does not have a name. I have spent a lot of time in a state of healing and retrieval to be able to write these words and give them to the world. I have also spent a lot of time in a state of reflection, examining my own intentions behind giving these words to the world. There are moments when I realize that one day this book will be in someone's hands, and I can feel the butterflies rise from my belly to my throat. I am a girl again, on an old wooden roller coaster, awaiting the first plummet toward the ground. My heartbeat quickens. I wonder if I should have gotten on the ride. My palms sweat. I question if I was meant to write the book. Then I remember. Yechike Nasji. I remember things from long ago. I remember all the women who held space for me while I worked to erase the records of violence that my body held. I know there are women out there with similar stories, with records on their body that have not been erased yet. I have sat with women who have been silenced, whose intergenerational lines of violence stretch themselves in an attempt to reach another generation. I have sat with women who have had to have vaginal reconstruction surgeries, and women who have been ostracized because of their quick tongues and demands for justice. I remember these women. I wrote this for you. I remember the sweaty hands and contorting body in crave of substance. I know that so many people are actively suffering from addiction. I know that other mothers are suffering from addiction. I've had a myriad of conversations with individuals surrounding sobriety and healing. I have prayed with strangers. I have hugged mothers who were trying to become sober. I remember believing that I would never achieve sobriety, and I write these words from this side of freedom. I remember those who struggle with addiction. I wrote this for you. I remember what it was like to believe I was a dispensable Indigenous woman. I have sat with women who have talked about scrubbing their skin, trying to achieve white. I have sat with women who have had to untangle the mess that a lifetime of stereotypes and racism leaves behind. I have held space for sisters who had to weep and wail away the colonial harm. I have held space for sisters whom we have lost to violence. I know that acts of violence against Indigenous women and girls are being perpetuated every single day. I remember you, sisters. I wrote this for you. I have written this book from the intersection of these 3 places of remembering. They are inseparable strands braided together. Without each of them, you would not have the full story. I summoned these words and the healing that comes with them to lighten the loads of shame, addiction, and struggle. I pray these words of remembering can somehow be medicine for you. I was told that this book will be a good tool to educate people who do not understand the impact of violence, racism, and colonialism in Indigenous women's lives. I was told that there will be people who gain insight from this book. I did not write this for you. I did not write this book so that people can learn how to humanize Indigenous women and gain context for the violence that seems to fill our lives. As an Indigenous woman, I once begged to be seen as a human. I promised myself I would never again beg for what is mine. I understand that your learning will be a byproduct of these words, and that is a good thing. We must understand each other in order to change the world. I invite you into this space with an open heart and with the requirement that you burn your pity and bury your judgments. As an Indigenous woman, we must sometimes unapologetically write for ourselves. I wrote this for us.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It was so amazing. So amazing.
I haven't read that in so long.
It was so good.
I got in my own feels for a minute there too. I was like, oh, don't cry. Yeah, and just remembering this space that I was in, when I wrote that and when it did come into the world and how scary it was. But
it's a gift. It's such a gift to the world. So thank you for having the courage and the strength to be able to tell your story and to share it with so many. If you could use your platform to encourage anyone who might be struggling with the after effects of sexual violence, addiction, or feeling comfortable talking to someone about their big feelings or emotions, what would you say?
I think one thing that I feel like we don't talk about enough when it comes to specifically sexual violence is learning how to reclaim safety and what that looks like. Because there's no guidebook, right? This is how you regain your sense of safety and self after experiencing something so hard as an individual. And I remember one time, I was like, okay, I was in my late 20s and I was like, I'm going to sleep naked. I had never done it before. And I was like, this is something I really want to do. And the next thing you know, I heard a sound. I freaked out. My door was barricaded. I was fully dressed. I had a desk in front of, everything was in front of the door. And I talked to my friend the day after and I was like, okay, how do I do this? How do I make myself know that I'm okay? And, I did a little prayer through my house and in terms of okay, I'm reclaiming the safety that was inherently mine from birth. This is something that's happening. But since then, I've also learned to ask people in my life that are my support systems for what I need. And I think sometimes as survivors and people are in a healing process, we don't even know what we need. We don't know how to vocalize it. It might look different for other people. But for me, it was when I was feeling out of sorts and I wanted to barricade something or I was feeling really unsafe and I knew it was trauma related, I would just text someone and be like, hey, can you tell me that I'm safe? And it would either be through text or phone call. And I'm like, I just need this reminder that I'm safe. And someone would call me or text me and just be like, yes, you're safe. Let me say this little prayer with you, or just reaffirming that. And that was something that, I had to learn the long and hard way, that I could ask for those things and that people would be willing to give that to me. So I think that's a big, probably belonged in the tool section of this conversation, but that one is big. So learn to ask for safety or the reminder of your safety when you need it. Learn to ask for things. I think that's probably the huge thing for any of those is like when you need help. Because I think that's the hardest thing. And even myself, someone who like has been like very hyper independent and has a hard time asking for help, like still learning that lesson of asking for things, and allowing people to kind of step into those spaces, or professionals to step into those spaces when you need it. And I think one of the things is like demystifying like the therapy space for people and knowing that, you know, you can find the model of therapy that you want. And I guess like building a language around that of like, what are the different therapies? What is CBT? What is EMDR? Like, what is somatic therapy? Which one really resonates with you before you go and find a health professional? Because you might find someone who is like talk therapy or does a version of therapy that doesn't vibe with you. And so you have that one experience and you're like, no, didn't work, don't like it. But what would work for you? I think that's important because even um, like setting up with my last therapist, I was like, okay, what do I want? And I'm like, I've switched from like more of a talking one to somatic because I believe like trauma lives in your body. So finding a somatic therapist and then being able to tell her like, okay, you know, I hear about what you're doing and knowing that's an interview for them as well and being like, this is me. I operate on an Indigenous worldview. This is how I see the world. This is how I interpret signs. Like, I'm not looking for that to be changed, but I need you to understand that this is where I'm coming from. And so, when I'm also telling you things or we're going through some of these processes, this is the type of reminder that I would like. Not trying to control the therapy process, but also like coming from like an Indigenous worldview is very different. When you're working with someone who is non-indigenous in that space. And so being able to kind of like lay that out for yourselves and have some, I guess, like autonomy and sovereignty in that healing space too is important. So I would encourage people to Google or YouTube like different modes of therapy if they're looking for a therapist so that they can find what fits right for them.
That was great. Thank you so much for that. This has been great. I'm so honored to be able to do this with you and to allow you to have a platform to tell your story. I mean, I know you have yours, but for me to be able to um, have you here and in this space, and after what your book was so touching to me, and I felt like it was such a gift to the world, and I'm just so honored to be able to have this opportunity to do this with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really good to be able to be in this space with you and to be able to have these conversations.
Indeed. Where can people find you online and on social media?
That's a good question. I knew I should have looked at my handles before I came on. I'm really bad at self promotion. So, but usually just some variation of my name. Helen Knott, HelenKnott. I think Instagram is Helen Knott05. Twitter, Helen Knott, possibly.
I'll put them in the description of the episode, so we're
Thank
good.
you.
And what about your books?
In My Own Moccasins is available, I think, through a lot of different avenues. You can find it on Audible as well. Becoming a Matriarch, unfortunately, only has a Canadian release. So this September it will be out, but it will only be available in Canada, I believe, and through print and audio and everywhere you could find books in Canada. And hopefully there will be some space for that to come into the US as well.
Alrighty. Well, again, thank you for this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the work that you've done to become who you are, to be able to share your story and give others a voice through you. Thank you for what you do, for how you do it, and for who you are.
Thank you.